Okay. Do you have a story you want to tell about your mother or about your family?
Well, I'll tell you about my mother, your grandmother,
Hmm.
who I have taken to referring to as FBK, which is for her initials, Fanny Becker Kaplan. Uh, my view of your grandmother has changed greatly in my life. It's impossible, I think, for somebody like me, it's certainly impossible for me, to talk about her without talking about myself because my knowledge of her has to do with our relationship. Um, my family life is dominated by FBK. She was, I was an only child. She was set adrift, as it were, as a single parent when my father died in 1952 when I was 13 years old. They'd been married since it's either 1935 or 1936, so they hadn't been married that long when my father died at a relatively early age of 54. He had high blood pressure and they didn't have medication to control it in those days. And I used to think of her when I was a child and when I was a young person in terms of the guilt trip she put on me because she was making so many sacrifices for me. And she did make those sacrifices. Um, as I've gotten older, particularly after she became a semi-invalid during her later years, she lived to be 102, as you know, and then certainly since she's died, I have reflected more often on just what a brave and persistent woman she was. I mean, a person like her has to have something that keeps them going because there's so many reasons to just quit. Um, I think she was helped by the fact that she was always an optimist. For her, the glass was always half full. I contrast that to myself. I'm pretty much of a pessimist. The glass is always half empty. And that actually served me pretty well as a lawyer. A lawyer needs to be a pessimist so he can plan for all the bad things and try to help his client prevent those bad things from happening. But in terms of meeting life's challenges, I think her natural optimism, her upbeat approach to life, her satisfaction with very little helped her very much. To understand what I'm talking about, I'll give you a few basic facts. When my father died in 1952, what few little assets he and my mother had been able to accumulate had been dissipated by his long illness without insurance. He had been suffering various maladies for a number of years, was basically uninsurable, and we didn't have the kind of protections that we have today about losing and getting insurance. And she just had to take on the world with the one asset he left her, which was this store. Well, they had a home, but they had a store, Kaplan's department store at Airways in Lamar. And she'd been running that store for a number of years anyway because he'd been too ill to really participate actively in management. The small dry goods store with, depending on what time of year you were talking about it, even somewhere between 2 and 5 employees, and in addition to my mother. And she just ran that store and supported us out of that store. There was no great family wealth. We had some close relatives who were very supportive, and some were monetarily supportive too at times when there was a need for money. But in fact, uh, she was my sole defense against the world. I didn't know it as a child. I didn't think about those things. I just went on as children do from day to day, meeting tomorrow's challenge, whatever that happens to be. But she had basically no social life except some interaction with other family members. I don't remember her ever having a true date after my father died. I think she did occasionally go to somebody's dinner party or something where she was paired off with another man, but I don't think that happened that often. It was just mother and me, or and I suppose is the correct grammatical construction. And she faced the world economically and to a certain extent emotionally, and I was basically responsible for the academic world, as it were, getting out of high school. I was lucky enough to be able to get some scholarships, go to college, go to law school. But she never let me get down. It was her optimistic and persistent approach to life. Keep on going. Everything will work all right. You just have to keep going. And even when she had other, after I was out on my own, after I was married and had a family, and economically I was I was very independent. She had her own challenges, and she just never gave up. And if you met her, she always had a big smile on her face. And I envy that way of being. I don't think I could ever be that way, but I do envy that kind of mindset. And I think she was very difficult sometimes for her to express anything other than a superficial kind of love, because she was so much involved in this. I guess she was involved in her own personality of being upbeat and of being able to express things in a humorous sort of way. She loved to tell stories, and as you know, she wasn't always telling the same story about the same thing. She tended to put a gloss on everything, and it got better and better and better and more dramatic, but it was always entertaining. So, in a way, I guess my understanding of my mother, I used to think of her as my enemy. She was the person who prevented me from doing everything. There were not two authority figures. There were not three authority figures in my family. There was one. And she stood between me and all of the things I wanted to do that I shouldn't be doing. So I blamed her for a lot of the disappointments, momentary disappointments I had in life. And that continued well after I got out of law school. But ultimately I began to understand that she was fighting enough battles just to take care of herself, that she was certainly not consciously doing anything to prevent me from achieving what I wanted to achieve, short term and long term.
Okay. So, what is sold in a dry goods store in the 1950s in Memphis?
Well, I don't think there would be an absolute rule, but
in Kaplan's?
Men's and ladies ready to wear, maybe probably a man, you wouldn't have men's suits, but you would have ladies' dresses. Blue jeans, work clothes, hats, gloves, shoes, perhaps some small non-valuable jewelry items, tie clasp. People don't even have tie clasps anymore, but maybe cufflinks, costume jewelry, that sort of thing. maybe in some other dry goods stores you might have some small appliances. In ours, there was no such thing. Those would be more apt to have been an appliance store or a hardware store. Uh, but shoes, blue jeans, work clothes,